I'm joined now by Jonathan Haslam, who was John Major's Director of Communications when he was Prime Minister. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan. Always a pleasure. I just touched upon something there with Nigel Nelson, and we've gone over some of the detail of what Boris said today. I wanted to talk to you about his delivery. And it seemed to me, and you'll know much more about this than I, having been the Director of Communications for a Prime Minister, Boris seemed to have been very well schooled, very well drilled in, dare I say it, not saying an awful lot. In a sense, he gave a great performance. He was magnanimous. He didn't blame others. He didn't rise to any of the criticism of him from other people who've given evidence, such as Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock. In that sense, how do you rate his performance?
It's fascinating to watch this because we need to go back a little bit and consider the fact that there's been an awful lot of advanced briefing of his side of the story. And that's come out in a couple of our heavier newspapers. And we've seen a little bit more of it from his so-called friends. But now, on the day, what do we see? We see a Boris Johnson who, yes, he is very well schooled and he's a very, very good media performer. We shouldn't forget he's got bags of experience in that respect. I'm surprised because his appearance is the typical shambolic Johnson. He's got a lot more hair than I have, but at least he could do is to comb it, actually, and to look smart. And that would be a matter of being respectful to the members of the audience who clearly have lost family members. And I think it's kind of unfortunate that they made a bit of a noise at the start of proceedings and had to be put down by Baroness Hallett. But nonetheless, Boris is saying quite a lot of things. He is taking very great care to control his temper. I found it interesting that his emotions got the better of him. And we shouldn't underestimate the fact that these are incredibly stressful occasions for the individual. So, yes, it's a good, interesting performance. There is a big question about his memory. There's also a question about his WhatsApp messages. And I think there's also a wider question about the extent to which our King's Council is looking at, to a certain extent, digging through the ephemera. That is, the relationships with Dominic Cummings, the language that's been used, misogyny and such like. And yes, these attract an awful lot of attention. But as Nigel was saying just a moment ago, really what we've got to get to is there were mistakes made. How do we avoid them in the future? And how do we deal with things differently? And yes, okay, it's important to understand that there was a degree of chaos. We know that from all the documentation that we have. And I would rather that the KC moved on to more positive territory for the country about, you've had this experience, it wasn't great, how do you do it better next time?
Well, that's the pertinent question, Jonathan. And what was fascinating about the evidence before today, a lot of people had believed that Boris was more libertarian in his approach, maybe favoured a more Swedish-style approach, protect the vulnerable, protect the elderly, and allow the economy to function pretty much as normal. Yet today, we heard a different picture. Boris, he claims, was the one pushing for earlier lockdowns, and it was those around him who were more resistant. That was very, very surprising.
It was surprising, and we've got to look back again at other things. He has admitted that he was slow off the mark. I think it's rather odd when he said to the inquiry, we should have tweaked earlier. I mean, the question there is, why was the government not on high alert when it had heard and has all the intelligence about the difficulties that China was facing at the time, had seen some of our European countries involved in desperate circumstances? Italy comes particularly to mind. And why there was such great slowness in closing down our barriers. So there was a degree there where we have to think, why is it the government's not on high alert when you hear about these stories of things coming from China and that you have a new disease? Were they complacent because SARS, a predecessor, and other diseases hadn't really taken off for us? And yet in a globalized world, you know that we can be in China in 9 hours by plane. We should be much, much more alert to that. And that just points to a problem within government. And I think you'll probably find it's exacerbated by Boris Johnson's rather cavalier way of dealing with meetings. And we just had an explanation a little while ago in the live commentary that he was finding it difficult to understand which meeting he was in. Well, there needs to be a lot more clarity. And I think that comes back to a wider point, which I bang on about as an ex-civil servant, of the demarcation lines between politicians and then the political side and the civil service, and understanding where you get the best decision making coming for it. And if Boris Johnson found himself confused in which meeting he was actually sitting and chairing, that indicates there's a real problem of control and understanding and the machinery of government. And it's not just the civil service. There are three parts to this. Politicians, they should give the lead. Civil servants need to feed the machine and then take action on its behalf, and with political direction. And the discombobulating factor is the political aides and the spin doctors who have too much influence. And therefore, I think Dominic Cummings has quite a lot to answer for in an individual capacity for what he was doing within government.
OK, Jonathan Haslam, former John Major Director of Communications, thank you very much for joining us. And